Dr. Azavedo was actually on my PhD committee when I was a student at Carnegie Mellon, so it's been a real pleasure to have lunch with her today and spend some time with her. And I think you'll certainly enjoy her talk. Dr. Azavedo is an assistant professor in engineering and public policy and the co-director of the Center for Climate and Energy Decision-Making at Carnegie Mellon University. Her research interests lie at the intersection of environmental, technical, and economic issues, such as how to address the challenge of climate change and to move towards a more sustainable energy system. She tackles complex problems in which traditional engineering plays a role, but cannot provide a complete answer. Those are the fun kind of problems. In particular, she has been looking at how energy systems are likely to be shaped in the future, which requires comprehensive knowledge not only of the technologies that can address future energy needs, but also of the decision-making process followed by different agents in the economy. Dr. Azavedo holds a PhD in Engineering and Public Policy from Carnegie Mellon. She holds an MS in Engineering Policy and Management of Engineering and Policy and Management of Technology, and a BS in Environmental Engineering from IST Lisbon. Today she's going to talk about trade-offs in climate mitigation strategies. So please welcome me please welcome Inês here. And she's also been promoted recently from assistant professor to associate professor, which is coming this summer. So congratulate her on that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Yep. So can everyone hear me okay if I don't have the mic on? Yeah, it sounds that it is good. And I'll kind of hide over here and walk a little bit around. It's a great pleasure to give a talk to you folks over here at UT Austin. This is my first time in Texas and first time in Austin and so forth. This is absolutely a lovely place, so very, very impressive. And so what I'll be talking about today is a series of 3 pieces of research work. And then at the end of the talk, I have a couple of slides. A couple of slides on additional work that we have going on as part of a climate and energy decision-making center. The 3 pieces of research had to do with trying to assess the regional variations in health, environmental, and climate benefits of wind and solar across the United States. I'll move this over here. Okay. So this work has been supported by the Climate and Energy Decision-Making Center. So just one slide about that, which is a center funded by the National Science Foundation that started back in 2010, and with the goal of looking at different types of aspects related to sustainable energy transitions in the United States. And before I start with the talk, I would actually like to have a vote. Let's assume that we need to install the next solar panel in the United States. Let's have a vote. Who thinks we should put the next solar panel in San Francisco? And who thinks that we should have the next solar panel in Pittsburgh? So, San Francisco. Okay, Pittsburgh. You guys have read the paper, right? That's right. So we'll get back to this issue, but just big picture sort of thing. We indeed need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by roughly an order of magnitude. The new IPCC report just came out claiming again that reductions in the order of 40 to 70% are needed. And while China surpassed the United States in terms of overall greenhouse gas emissions, the US continues to be a very large contributor and with the potential to reduce emissions to a large extent. In particular, when we start looking at where our energy services come from and the type of things throughout the energy system that contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. So what you see simply in this flow is the emissions in terms of the IPCC reporting categories and sectors associated with greenhouse gases, and on the right side, the amount of emissions of different types of greenhouse gases. And so not surprisingly, 87% of greenhouse gas emissions are associated with the provision of energy services, and a large part of that has to do with the provision of electricity and heat, about a third of it. The other issue when we start looking at, you need me to pause? Yeah.
Can we mic you up?
Yeah. So, but this is doing a lot of feedback. Okay.
Try again?
You want me to put it on, actually, or leave it here?
See,
I can move it over here.
he just said he wasn't getting any audio.
this going to be okay? Well, even louder than previously. Okay, the United States grid, as you can see in the plot, has an old fleet and partially dirty in terms of the reliance on fossil fuels. So what you see in the plot is the amount of nameplate capacity over time for coal, natural gas, and in most recent years we see an increase in wind and also an increase in natural gas again in terms of the capacity. But we cannot look at the US grid as a single unit. If we indeed look at the differences regionally, the US grid's carbon emissions factors vary widely from the west to the Midwest and everywhere across the country, from less than 0.4 to more than 0.70 kilograms of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So the question that we're going to address today is first, how can we characterize what generators are being displaced as we promote different types of interventions in the grid? And those interventions can be increase in wind, solar PV, energy efficiency, and so forth. What sort of frameworks can we develop and implement to characterize those changes, namely when we're doing marginal small changes that are continuous over time, rather than jumping into a 20% renewable scenario? But we don't care as much about the emissions in itself and the characterization of the generators at the margin. What we'd like to do is the effects associated with those displacements. So the second question is, what are the monetized values of health and environmental damages that may be avoided from such interventions? So what you see in this plot, this is results not from our research, but from the APIP model, a model that assigns damages associated with criteria pollutants such as SO2 across the country. And we see a variation that ranges from $1,000 per ton of emissions to $15,000 per ton of emissions. And so what do you guys think is going on here that explains the diversity in those values? The same ton of emissions is getting very different amounts of damages. Population. Population density differences across the country are driving most of those results, right? So there is some issues associated with the location of the power plants, the dispersion of the pollutants, and where are the populations located downstream and their density. Demographics also playing a role, but in particular population density. So here's the issue and the challenge that we would like to do. Basically, if we had the ideal model for the United States, we would always know which power plant would be at the margin and the associated emissions from that power plant. So this is a completely made-up system, just a hypothetical system where we see the dispatch of those power plants as function of marginal cost in the first plot. And in the second plot, we see the CO2 emissions associated with 1 megawatt of operation of that power plant. So here is the challenging the thing that we would like to track. Assume that we have an intervention, maybe an energy efficiency in the lighting sector that is able to displace the generation at peak hours. We may be displacing natural gas, which will have lower emissions than coal. And we may have other sorts of interventions that are actually not displacing things at peak, but at some other hours where we'll be displacing coal. Again, this is an hypothetical system, but this is the sorts of things that we would like to track for any place in the United States. And the point is that if we, instead of using and try to assess what emissions were being displaced, we use average emissions factors, that's a good initial proxy. But the issue is that we're not able to detect, even if we're biasing the emissions and the associated damages, upwards or downwards. We don't have a way to check that. And that same bias will depend on the intervention, the type of day, and the location in the United States. So what we propose to do is to actually use available data, historical data, to develop and implement a framework that enable us to track what emissions are being displaced. Indeed, with available information that is available to us today. And the goal is to be able to use that in a systematic way across different places in the United States. So there are really good models that are able to simulate the generators that are at the margin for different regions in the United States. The challenge is, how do you compare things across the country? Okay. And so that's the work that we've been promoting and developing in different pieces. And I showed the image of this Kyle Seller-Evans, who was the PhD student working with me in this piece. By the time he defended his dissertation, the first piece was out, and he decided to do a coast-to-coast bike trip as we were trying to submit the second paper to PNAS. By the time he was on the other coast, the paper was out, so that was a success. He was able to do the bike trip and also submit the PNAS piece, and I'm just showing Granger Morgan and Jay Abt, who are the two other co-authors in that second piece. Okay, so we can look at the characterization of those emissions of the grid from simple to more complex models, as I was mentioning. And the framework that I'm going to now start to explain is based on a regression methods-based approach with very simple regressions that get us at what are the marginal emissions factors. As we do so, it is worthwhile to point out that policymakers are obviously not interested only, if at all, on CO2 emissions when designing the policies, but also on other things. And so we selected 3 metrics of performance as we do this analysis: energy production, climate benefits from displaced CO2 emissions, and health and environmental benefits from displaced criteria pollutants, for which we account for SO2, NOx, and PM2.5 emissions. So here is a first qualitative overview of the methods, and then we'll go on to more detail about the development of this framework. We basically gather the emissions for every single power plant in the United States on an hourly basis. We estimate the health and environmental damages associated with those emissions. We use regressions to then relate the change in damages that will occur as the conventional generators are displaced. And then we need to combine this information with the information about the intervention that we're pursuing, wind or solar. So we basically then pair that up on an hourly output of wind and solar PV across many places in the United States. So let's look at this step by step. First, for every single county in the United States, we have the damages in dollars per ton for all the point sources that produce electricity from fossil fuel-based generators, for SO2, NOx, and PM2.5. And that data is not something that we provided, it's something that we take from the APIP model. And it basically relates to the map that I was showing previously. It corresponds to the same approach that the National Research Council report has used on the hidden cost of energy. And so what APIP does, what we extract from that model, is APIP simulates for any point source the dispersion of the pollutants, the resulting concentrations in each of the US counties, and then uses a dose response function to relate the emissions and their concentrations to health effects, reduce crop and timber yields, and so on. And the final thing that APIP does is to monetize those impacts in terms of how those response function then relates to the damages in terms of health and environmental impacts, and through the assumption of a value of a statistical life of $6 million. And we could have an entire session talking about the appropriateness of using those sorts of values versus any other values. So the results from this APIP model provide us the average county dollar per ton damages for criteria pollutants. Then we want to also account for greenhouse gas emissions, for CO2 emissions. And so there is a whole other debate that we could have about the appropriateness of a value for the social cost of carbon and what that value should be. For this particular study, we assume a $20 per ton of CO2 for the social cost of carbon. This was within the range of social cost of carbon values that was put by the interagency working group in an initial report from 2010. Since then, DOE and EPA have updated those numbers for a new range. And so in the work that we have now in review related to the marginal impact factors, we actually used a $40 per ton of CO2 value instead. But there is a wide debate about how would you value indeed the social cost of carbon and what's the appropriate value that one should use. So we have the damages as function of emissions under control. Now we want to locate that to the emissions from the actual power plants. So for 1,400 power plants, and we're only looking at fossil fuel-based generation, we're not including renewables, we have the location, the fuel type, the stack height, and the hourly emissions for CO2, SO2, NOx, and PM2.5. This is a unique data set that the US has available for anyone to use, a continuous emission monitoring system, for which we use data from 2009 to 2011. The good thing about this data source is that every so often, the Environmental Protection Agency puts out again the new hourly emission data, so it can continuously be updating those emissions from the power plants on an hourly basis to rerun our results and see how those change over time as function of decline in natural gas prices, for example, retirements of power plants that are ongoing, and so forth. SEMS does not include data on direct PM2.5 emissions, so we took that data from the National Emissions Inventory and used correlations between the plant output and emissions of other criteria pollutants to then estimate the hourly emissions from PM2.5. And finally, we used e-grid data for plant locations and fuel type. Okay, so for each subregion of the United States, and now the other question that we could debate is what sort of regional aggregation one would want to use to compute those sorts of marginal emissions factors and their impact. We selected the e-grid regions given that there's not too much imports and exports across the regions. We also did run the results at the NERC level regions, larger regions, to see how sensitive our results are. And so for each of those regions, which we treat separately, we compute the hourly damages in dollars per hour as function of by doing the multiplication of the damages in dollars per ton times the hourly emissions in terms of ton of pollutant per hour that we have from the SEMS data. And just for reference, what the subregions that we're looking at look like. Okay, then for every e-grid subregion and for every pollutant, we do the following. We bin the data into 20 gross generation beans. Why are we doing that? Because there are not necessarily linear relationships between damages and generation for the overall changes. We may have non-linearities, but by binning the data into some samples, we're basically able to use a simple linear regression for every single one of those beans and then put that information together as function of gross generation. So for every single one of those generation beans, we do the change in damages as function of the data, the change in generation from 1 hour to the next. And so let me just enlarge this so that it's clear. This is for ERCOT and just for SO2 emissions. We see that in hours of low demand, the relationship between changes in damages and changes in generation are roughly $19 per megawatt hour, while in hours of high demand, it's virtually zero. And so this simply depends on the plants that are at the margin at those hours, right? Where in hours of high demand, over here, natural gas is at the margin, and so obviously there are no damages associated with SO2 emissions because there are no SO2 emissions. Okay, and the final step is to compute the marginal damages in terms of dollars per megawatt hour, which is basically the coefficients of the regressions that we've just performed, as function of the total generation. So let me enlarge that again. So we're again looking at SO2 as an example. So the $19 per megawatt hour correspond to the stack of the heights on the plot in your right for the SO2 emissions. And you see that for high demand, those are virtually zero. And we do that for every single one of the pollutants. We do that for the different e-grid regions in the United States. So by this point, we have a good characterization of the marginal damages as function of total fossil fuel generation for the different regions of the United States. We now need to look at the other side of the puzzle, which is as we promote different types of interventions, what are exactly the damages that we're going to be avoiding? So we've done so for 33,000 sites, wind sites, using the EWITS and the Western Wind and Solar Integration Study. In both cases, those are simulated data. So it's data that provides simulated capacity factors or wind production at all those different sites across the United States. We've done the same for solar. So using 900 sites from the National Solar Radiation Database, we're able to have the capacity factors or output from a solar PV panel as we're located in different places across the country. So for every single one of those sites, what we've done is to look at a certain hour of the year and to match the output from the wind farm at that hour of the year with the damages that it is displacing in that same hour. And basically running things then for a full entire year for both wind and solar. And finally, we're able to actually aggregate all the avoided damages over the course of a year and express that in terms of a weighted average in dollars per megawatt hour or in dollars per megawatt. So let's look at a little bit at some of the results. First, looking at solar and looking at the capacity factor or the energy performance of putting that solar panel in different places across the country. And this is not surprising. This is what one would expect solar would perform in terms of extracting electricity from the panel, much better in places like Arizona, New Mexico, or Southern California. And we see factors as high as 45% differences when we compare a solar panel in Arizona to a solar panel in Maine. This is known, so this part of the analysis is not really novel. So let's now look at the avoided CO2 emissions and the value associated with avoiding those CO2 emissions across the country. So here you go. We have the locations of avoided CO2 emissions, both in terms of amount of CO2 and also on the associated dollar value of CO2 being avoided. And we decided to express both quantities exactly given the uncertainty and debate about what's the actual social cost of carbon that one should use. And so if we look at the amount of CO2 emissions avoided, then the best regions for locating the solar panel are Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas, where we see that there are moderate solar resources, but at the same time, as someone was saying, displacing coal power plants at the margin. Jump this one. So a couple of surprises here. Despite the poor solar resource, a solar panel in South Carolina is expected to displace 20% more CO2 than a solar panel in Arizona. And Florida is about the worst place to put a solar panel in terms of reducing CO2 emissions. What about health and environmental benefits? So over here in the third map, we're aggregating the benefits for health and environmental issues for SO2, NOx, and PM 2.5, and showing that in terms of dollars per kilowatt hour, per kilowatt installed. And so we see that solar PV in Ohio would offer 17 times more the health and environmental benefits than a solar panel in Arizona, even though the solar panel in Ohio produces 30% less energy. And again, the reason is simple. The plants that are at the margin are systematically old and more dirty coal power plants in those areas. And not only that, but they are upwind from major population centers and thus inducing much larger health and environmental damages. So in a nutshell, from an energy standpoint, Arizona is the best place for the solar panel. But if we're deploying renewable technologies to avoid health and environmental damages, it ends up that that's the worst place for your next solar panel. Okay, let's look at the results for wind. And actually, if folks over here have data that I can use for Texas, that would be awesome to complement the research, given that the two other data sets do not include the simulated data for wind. So first of all, the energy performance, and again, no surprises on that front. From an energy standpoint, wind turbines perform best in the Great Plains through West Texas, and capacity factors can reach 40%. And we see that in very much of the East and the West, the performance is not as good. What about CO2 emissions being avoided? So in this particular case, the wind turbines are most effective at displacing CO2 when located in the Midwest. And the reason is that the capacity factors are really good in that area, and at the same time we're displacing coal-fired generators. And we see that other sites like Oklahoma would be less beneficial because of gas-fired power plants being displaced and most often at the margin. We also see that wind turbines in California would be amongst the least effective at displacing CO2 emissions. A wind turbine in Kansas would displace 2.5 times more CO2 than in California. And finally, the same assessment, but in terms of health and environmental benefits associated with wind throughout the country. And once again, a wind turbine in West Virginia would displace quite more, 7 times more damages than a wind turbine in either Oklahoma or 27 times more than in California. So let's talk a little bit about implications for renewable energy subsidies. What we've done is to, and this is using 2010 data, to look at the locations of existing wind farms by 2010, and using the values of the marginal damages avoided, try to capture the overall nationwide health and environmental benefits associated with wind. And we end up with the back of the envelope calculation that provides us the value of $2.6 billion. And so what we'd like to do is to compare that with the value of the subsidies that have been provided annually. They just expired now in 2014, but for the production tax credit for wind. And if we do that, we see that the annual cost of the PTC has been $1.6 billion. So overall, we're being able, if we just, this is not a full benefit cost analysis, by comparing those two, we do see that we're being able to extract more health and environmental benefits from wind than the cost of the subsidy. Now, it's interesting to see the differences across different regions in the United States. So if we compute the dollars per megawatt hour of health and environmental damages avoided in Pennsylvania, we reach a value when we look at CO2, PM2.5, SO2, and NOx of close to $90 per megawatt hour. And if we do the same thing in California, we see a value of 10. And despite that, both regions are receiving the same PTC, were receiving the same level of subsidy. This is not to say that necessarily the values of the incentives need to be changed. The reason for California to have that lower amount of damages is because they have invested in the past in a cleaner grid. But it's worthwhile highlighting the differences across the regions. Now, a couple of limitations and key assumptions that we've done throughout the study and that you may have some questions about. The first one has to do with imports and exports of electricity. We do see that there are several regions that are importing and having flows, and for sake of simplicity, we're treating every single one of those regions separately. So one of the things that we're working on right now is how can we capture also the flows of electricity across regions when we're looking at those sorts of damages associated with each of those. But one of the tests that we've done for the sensitivity was to rerun our results using larger, broader regions where we know there are very little flows of imports and exports of electricity. So here you see the same maps and the same results for CO2, for the criteria pollutants, for wind, and for solar, but using NERC regions instead of the E-grid regions. And of course, the values will differ, but the trends across the different regions are still sustained as we make such comparison. We do see interesting things, which is when we use the NERC regions instead of California as a standalone region, the CO2 emissions from wind and solar in California increased by roughly 15% when we compare it with the original assessment. I've already mentioned previously the social cost of carbon value and its issue. The way the model is set up is that the damages associated with CO2 basically very linearly with the value that we assume for the CO2 damages. So one can clearly understand how the size of the bar associated with the damages avoided from greenhouse gas emissions would change as we make different assumptions for CO2. And the other critical assumption is the value of a statistical life. And so I'll jump this one, but one of the things that we've also performed was a sensitivity analysis to that valuation. So we see some of the E-grid regions for different cases. A first case where it's the base case using a $6 million figure. A second case where you use a life year method that discounts differently the impacts depending on the demographics and the age of folks. A third case, same thing, but assuming that the base value of a statistical life is 2 million. Same thing, but with 10 million. And this is an alternative dose response function. The values are obviously going to scale up and down depending on those assumptions, but the critical thing being that the differences across regions are going to be maintained no matter those assumptions. The other issue to account for is that over the time that we use for some of our analysis, and mainly for previous analysis, there were ongoing markets for SO2 and NOx and how to control for that. We did the sensitivity by selecting different years of analysis, and the main results that we have don't change tremendously. And the final thing is, well, we've gone through this exercise of computing marginal emissions factors from 1 hour to the next, but we've done the same assessment using instead average emissions factors, and the regional differences are sustained. So it's a better characterization of the changes from hour to hour, but the overall results don't change tremendously if we use average emissions factors. And the final thing, which is, I started the talk by mentioning that we're looking at marginal changes in the electricity sector. And of course, in terms of decision, that's not the most interesting question. We want to see what is going to happen if we do have 10, 15, 30% of renewables in the grid. So can we apply this method to assess some of those effects? And the issue is that it's not as appropriate to do so. We can do some thought exercises, and we've done so. For example, we do know that there are going to be a lot of retirements for coal-fired generators. And we kind of know where those are going to occur. So what we've done is to actually select the oldest and more SO2 intensive coal generators, remove them from the data set, and assume that at whatever times those generators were being used, we would instead have a natural gas power plants. And so what happens to the results? Well, it turns out that most of those generators that are going to be retired and that have those high emissions intensities are in the RFC region, so where I'm from. And so we do see that by removing those, a decline in terms of the marginal impact factors when compared to the base case, but still many of the regional variations continuing to happening. Okay, and so just a note, in terms of making this data and models available to the public, all the data that and the regressions that I just mentioned were already made available in our website so that other researchers can actually test the effect of different types of interventions in the grid, for example, energy efficiency, vehicle electrification, and so forth. And the other thing that we're doing right now is updating already those marginal impact factor spreadsheets so that researchers could download it and use it in terms of factors by year, by season, and by time of day, and help us know what we need to improve also in terms of making something that is usable, available, and out there. And so this is the other thing that we put out is basically the share of fossil fuel generation. Remember, this doesn't account for the share of renewables, but how often is coal versus natural gas at the margin for every single one of the regions in the United States. So conclusions for this part, and I'll move on just to outlining some of other work that we have going on. The regional differences in the performance of renewables are significant, and the marginal environmental and health benefits from wind and solar range from $10 to $100 per megawatt hour. And in many cases, the most attractive sites for renewables are going to depend on one's objective. And if the objective is to have production-based subsidies, we saw that, that the locations are basically the capacity factors associated with those renewables. But the issue is that by just having incentives that make the independent power producers locate wind and solar on high energy sites, we may be missing the point of the other goals associated with development of renewable energy policies. So I'll move on very quickly to other work, and then we'll open up for questions. So we've been working quite a bit on issues related to energy efficiency. And so in a nutshell, how many of you are familiar with the McKinsey cost abatement supply curve? One couple. So what McKinsey did back in 2007 was for 2030 to just plot the cost effectiveness of different types of strategies to abate carbon as function of the potential for abatement. And it showed that there was a lot of potential for energy efficiency and many other things to be pursued that had actually negative costs. So the consumers would be able to save money and at the same time reduce CO2 emissions. And that's quite interesting, but one of the problems with that analysis is that the data was not made available on the underlying assumptions and cost estimates that led to that conclusion. By that time, the National Academies was also developing a cost on America's energy future. One of those studies was on energy efficiency. And along those lines, we got interested in trying to characterize what is the potential for energy efficiency in the residential sector in the United States. So using data from the DOE on stock and efficiency of current appliances and devices across the country, we're able to simulate what the efficiency supply curves, that potential and the associated costs look like, and under different sets of assumptions regarding whether or not we allow for fuel switching between electricity and natural gas, whether consumers are only going to look at a subset of energy efficiency strategies versus a bunch of them. And so we do conclude that in terms of technically we could reduce the emissions associated with the residential sector by as much as 56%, but that would require a tremendous amount of upfront costs. And from that, only the 30% reductions will be indeed cost effective. This relates to another issue, which is if we have all those $100 bills on the floor, why aren't consumers actually pursuing those strategies in energy efficiency? So there are several sets of barriers and lack of information that may explain that transition not happening. One of the associated issues that we got interested in understanding more about is how much of this reduction in energy savings is due to rebound effects. And so this is another of my PhD students, former PhD student, Brenda Thomas. So the rebound effect is this issue. If I switch in my house from incandescent lamps to LEDs, have the perception that I'll be saving money over the lifetime of the investment, and so I can do a couple of things. First, I can leave the lights on for a couple more hours. It's a small effect. It has been shown in the literature that that's a small effect. And the other thing is that I could use the savings that I have from that energy efficiency investment to spending on something that may be more carbon or energy intensive than what I was doing in the first place. So is this a big effect? Is this a small effect? How much of the energy efficiency strategies that we're pursuing are going to be eroded by those sorts of behavioral effects? So we looked at that on two fronts. The most interesting thing is that kind of 2 years ago, a very large debate and fight emerged between folks from the Breakthrough Institute, LBNL, and other groups on whether those effects are going to be really large, and so we shouldn't be investing in energy efficiency policies versus proven to be small and non-problematic. And the issue is that the different groups were actually using different notions and taxonomy while talking about those effects. So one thing is the dimension of the direct rebound effect, leaving the lights on. The second is the indirect rebound effects. Where am I going to respend the money from those energy efficient strategies? And finally, how is the economy overall going to adjust to those changes of the selection of more efficient products, so the macroeconomic rebound effect. So one of the things that we've done was to bring together people from different areas of expertise working in that domain, economists, policy analysts, and engineers, and try to see where was the difference in the notions that they were applying. Why would we see ranges in the literature that would range from negative rebound effects to actually 300% or so? And much of that was just an issue of the taxonomy that different groups and the research areas being so different. But the other thing that we've done is to do our own development of a model and empirical analysis. So in two pieces in ecological economics, what we have actually done is to combine a consumer behavior model, a neoclassical consumer behavior model, with a model that we have in-house at Carnegie Mellon called IULCA, which is basically an input-output life cycle assessment model. What that provides you is that if you invest $1 in a certain sector of the economy, what are the supply chain effects in terms of energy and carbon emissions? Okay, the punchline being, even in the worst case scenario, the rebound effects are small. Even if we take into account the overall supply chain effects associated with redistribution of those savings in other goods and services, we're not going to see a tremendous amount of rebound effects. And the way we've tested this is actually to use both a base case, then compare that with the life cycle impact of a case without any sort of rebound, and then with two other cases, a case where the consumers were going to respend the savings in the same proportion of goods that they had been doing previously prior to the energy efficiency investment, and another model where we take into account for price and income and substitution elasticities across products. And I'll actually jump to this one. We've done that both nationally and then looked at different states. So when we look at the different states, we actually start by looking at the carbon footprint of households in that state, including scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, really the full supply chain of the emissions. We account for the different patterns of consumption across the states using the consumer expenditure survey. And so what you see in the y-axis, the dashed white bar is the potential savings that we have if rebound effects are not taken into account. And then the tiny little bars are the rebound effects that you get from direct rebound effects and all the indirect supply chain effects. And you can see that those are small in comparison to the overall savings, and they're a wide set of assumptions. The other area of work that we've been, I'll be done in less than that. Yeah. The other area of work had to do with transition to more efficient lighting and solid state lighting in particular. So I'll mention quickly that in an earlier piece on the proceedings of the IEEE, we tried to look at when would LEDs be at cost parity in a life cycle basis when compared to incandescent light bulbs or CFLs. And the finding at the time was that before 2015, LEDs would have the same life cycle costs as incandescents, and this turns out to be about right now today. But we also posed the question of, are there any additional savings in buildings that we could have, namely in commercial buildings, to use LEDs by using DC circuits to power the LEDs, in particular for those locations that already have solar PV panels which produce DC electricity. And through simulations we'll be able to show that even today, using fairly high levels of costs for DC wiring of commercial buildings, pairing up commercial buildings that already have solar PV with the DC circuits to power DC devices would make sense economically. And finally, some of those results have been provided in the National Academy's report that I participated on the Advance for Solid State Lighting. But again, in this area, technology is not the problem. Issues related to the adoption of new technologies are the key limitation of seeing those sorts of transitions. And at Carnegie Mellon, we do have this new thing, which is this data truck that you see up there. It's basically a mobile lab that we can park anywhere across the city to test different things with participants from the city. In this particular case, we're interested in looking at the perceptions of brightness and color of different light types and try to see whether those matched nicely or not the technical attributes that we see in the labels for light bulbs, like the CCT and the lumens per watt. And we see indeed that's not the case. So there is several things that relate in people's mind brightness and the color of the lights, so that lights that are slightly geared more towards the blue appear as being more bright, And that is not something that is apparent in the packaging or the light bulbs of the light bulbs. And one final example to wrap up related to small modular nuclear reactors. This is basically a new technology, and some R&D funding has been put out there for small-scale nuclear reactors, and those are really units that range from 50 megawatt electric to 300 megawatt electric. Those technologies are in pilot testing phase, many of those in terms of having blueprints and designs but not having been implemented. And the critical thing is that no one knows how much they are going to cost. And the cost of those units is going to make a huge difference on whether they are likely to be deployed in some niche markets anytime soon versus not. So we did an expert elicitation looking at, so with folks from national labs, vendors from the nuclear industry, and academics, trying to elicit how much would an N-of-a-kind unit of this sort cost in the future. And we actually also elicited the costs from Gen 3 reactors as a point of comparison. And so not surprisingly, the uncertainty is quite large. So this is for different experts. And while I'm not going to show that in the slides, the interesting thing is that if we were to believe the experts, when we convert this in terms of cost of electricity, this technology that doesn't really exist yet will be already at cost parity in some regions of the United States. So this tells quite a little bit about both expert elicitation methods, but also the optimism that we have towards technology that are not yet in place. And with that, I'll actually conclude and open for questions.
I'll let you call on them. No worries.
Oh, sure.
Of course.
Thank you so much for being here today. Terrific presentation. I actually have a question about one of the papers you mentioned briefly at the end, the rebound effects paper. When you were looking at rebound effects, like what was the original group that you were looking at? Were you looking at homeowners who had proactively acquired energy efficient products and services, or were you looking at, you know, a big utility initiative and gains that they had made, and how that played out in their service territory?
So the way we've done this is actually a simulation tool rather than any sort of econometric model that actually used data before and after efficiency interventions. So what we're doing is let's look at the bundle of goods and expenditures for the average household across those different states. Let's assume that there is an efficiency intervention that decreases their electricity consumption, natural gas consumption, or gasoline consumption by 10%. And let's see what is going to happen in the redistribution of those things towards the supply chain. So this is a simulation method. It is not an econometric one. Okay, so that's a good question. The folks that are trying to empirically assess, there's quite some pieces of work that are trying to do that at Berkeley, at the A School right now, in terms of trying to actually quantify empirically what those sorts of effects may be.
Hi. My question is related to the first work you presented. So could you elaborate a little more on the displacement assumption you used when the marginal concept there? Based on my understanding, I don't think the wind and solar will just displace the marginal generations because they're sometimes they can display base load. And yeah, I think, have you considered any dispatch model for that work?
So that's an open question that definitely deserves to be done, meaning we have not compared the performance of dispatch models with the regression-based approach that we've taken over here. But the issue that you're mentioning, meaning are the renewables displacing baseload versus the marginal generation, are indeed accounted for in this framework. Because the way we characterize, given that we're using historical hourly emissions, we're able to track whatever emissions were displaced from 1 hour to the next. Whether you call it baseload or the marginal generation, we do account for that difference, right? What we do not account for is what would happen if instead there is a growth to 20% renewables. Because then the system as we have it characterized right now would not be valid. It would be operating in a completely different way, and that we cannot assess with this model. But in terms of the actual emissions being displaced, that's one of the things that we account for. Yeah. Here's one.
I was wondering if does wind or solar have better effects, like between the two of them? Which one displaces more of the coal and stuff like that?
We haven't done that explicit comparison between the two yet.
Okay.
That's, yeah. Given the scale being so different, it's really hard to decide what would be an appropriate metric of comparison. But that's a fair question and something that we should do. Yeah, that's a good one.
So I've read some studies that talk about how as the penetration of renewable energy gets larger, you also need a larger share of backup energy source, namely like the traditional generation facilities. So have you considered that possibility in your research?
So work from other folks in my group has shown that indeed, as you try to have renewables at the level of 20% or so, you would need natural gas basically that would be able to cope with intermittency or other strategies that would enable you to do so. That indeed, under some cases, and depending on what is the type of generator that you'll be using, you may be increasing the emissions, namely NOx emissions, by a non-trivial amount. The way we have formulated it right now, we are really assuming that the solar and wind by itself doesn't need anything else given those small marginal changes. We could and should probably use a penalty on the emissions and damages savings to account for that coping of intermittency and ramping up and down of some of the existing generators or new generators when we're making the calculations. We haven't done that yet, but it's a fair comment, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks again for coming. Really quick question. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the assumptions used regarding the healthcare costs, whether that's all based off of the $6 million cost per life, or whether there's heterogeneity in the cost of healthcare in the different regions and those assumptions.
So right now, all those assumptions came out of the way APIP was formulated. It was not our own modeling assumptions. We extract the data from another model, which indeed relies on the $6 million overall. We did in the sensitivity look at some of those differences. More than regional differences in healthcare costs and other things, it's worth pointing out that the health and environmental damages, even from APIP, are highly uncertain, and so that there is work going on right now showing that, for example, the damages associated with SO2 as a precursor of PM may be an order of magnitude off. So those values can really swing around depending on the air quality model that you're using. So I'm not an air quality modeler, and I do use the values that come out of those models, but there is a huge uncertainty there on what are the actual health and environmental dollar values that you should use. Yeah.
Thank you again. Excellent data, excellent presentation. So you may already have this data. You know, it's great to see the wind and solar displacing. That's the optimal as far as benefit. But it would seem like there's already a huge benefit in just repowering coal with natural gas, the combined cycle. And so maybe that's just data you had to omit. Just simply that conversion or that remix from SCED. Do you have that data in different papers? Because it isn't quite as exciting, perhaps, as wind or solar, but it still is so substantial.
So we have done in another paper the benefits of combined cycle. We haven't done the same systematic assessment as in this one, though you're not the first person when I give this talk asking for that to be done and referring that as a good thing to pursue next. So it's on the to-do list of next analysis.
Plus, you may need that also to complement one. Secondly, I had heard from different sources that with the new 100-meter turbines and such not, we were seeing some capacity factors of over 50%. Just found an NREL chart I'll send to you that shows that there's actually substantial capacity possible at over 50% capacity factor for wind.
Okay.
Even more compelling.
Okay, so yeah, so we should update it. Thanks.
No more questions?
One more?
I have one that's a little bit marginal.
Follow. Okay.
And this is, I should have probably saved this for talking to you later, but I was wondering if you could just quickly tell us what interpolation function you used for the, on the, when you have the entire mapped in the rasters for both the displaced capacity and the damages?
I'll check that and get back to you actually on the actual interpolation. So this is all done with one of the MATLAB interpolation functions in there. So yeah, I'll get back to you on which one we ended up using. Okay, that's good. That's a good, that's a good one.
All right, let's thank her for coming all the way down to Texas.
Thank you.